Hi guys, welcome to the Integrated Vitality Podcast, where we discuss all things health with a focus on neuroscience, integrated medicine, functional medicine, alternative medicine, and personal growth. And with us today, we have Sally Goddard Blythe. And Sally is the director of the Institute of the Neurophysiological Psychology Institute, INPP, and the author of a number of books on childhood development, learning and associated learning, behavioural and emotional issues. Her main roles are in clinical practice and international training in the INPP method, and is the author of the INPP program for schools. So Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No worries. So why don't we start a little bit about your, learning a little bit about your story, your educational background, and how you fell into working with the primitive reflexes.
Well, I think you're right in the use of the word fell into, because this was never a part of my life plan as such, if I had one. Excuse me a moment. My background was, I originally went to university to read history and fine arts. I'd come from a very traditional English convent boarding school, where when I said I would like to do psychology, I was told that this was not a nice subject. It wasn't a real subject. And that they didn't offer it for the last couple of years at school, that you still had to do things like the traditional Latin, history, maths, and so on. So went to read history and fine arts, and loved, surprisingly, the fine arts part of it, where it spent quite a lot of time covering the processes of visual perception and why the artist sees the world differently from how the rest of us do. And I was fascinated in that, and then it sort of got lost in having children and all the other things that come along in life. And one of my three children was picked up at the age of about 14 months as having a possible hearing impairment. And we spent a number of years in his early life trying to find a resolution to this. And so that when I eventually sort of met Peter and became interested in the work, and he said, I will train you. Although I had absolutely no academic background really to support what he said he would train me in some ways, some of the seeds of understanding it were sown, combined with the fact that my father was also a professional classical musician. And so when later on we came across Kjeld Johansen, who developed a method of sound therapy using music, the concept of using music to, using music to work just not on emotions but on cognition as well, was already something that I understood. So I trained with Peter in the sort of late 1980s, and then I said to him, I really need a formal qualification to back up what I'm doing. And so it was at that stage that I did a bachelor's and a master's in psychology. So I came into it completely sort of upside down and inside out. But I always feel that the background education I'd had, although it seemed to be very formal and rigid and traditional, had in certain areas prepared me for what I later came across and found that I'd fallen into doing, really.
Okay. Interesting and eclectic background there. It's awesome.
Yes.
And so,
not the science background you would hope for, really.
So you went and studied psychology, and so how did you end up learning about childhood development and neural development and primitive reflexes? How did you get into that area?
Well, I think that had come through the training of the work that Peter had done. So he and a colleague called David McGlowan in the late 1960s, early 1970s, had started what is now known as the INPP method. So they had started to look at children who were underachieving and to investigate patterns of motor development, eventually the presence or absence of primitive and postural reflexes. And gradually they had put together the protocols that we now use for screening, assessment and remediation. And so at the time I joined in 1987, 1988, they'd done all the groundwork in setting up a clinical structure to work with. And they'd done some research, but very little had really been written or published on what they'd done, how they'd got there and so on. And I said, you need to write this work up. You need to write it up so people will become more aware of it. You need to then write it up in such a way that it's replicable so that other people can do it, and that your training is not just a handful of people, but is something that can be passed on. And you need to research and provide evidence to support what it is that you've done. And purely, again, by chance, a colleague in Sweden had written a book on a related topic on sort of motor development, and said, would I check the English so that they could get an English translation of it? And the English was so awful. I looked at the first 2 chapters and I said, this isn't just a correction. This is a complete rewriting job. And I haven't really got time to do this at the moment. And he said, well, would you write me just a small pamphlet on primitive reflexes? And having done that, he said, now will you write one on postural reflexes? And now will you write one on the relationship between abnormal reflexes and sensory functioning? And suddenly we had the core of my first book, A Teacher's Window into the Child's Mind, which was published in that small format in Swedish first. And it was an American colleague who said, this is crazy. You need to have it in English. I've got a small publishing company. I will produce an extended English version. And that was the first book, which was really sort of chronicling what they had done at the time. But then so much of what has grown since, I always say, was not the ideas of individuals. It was the sparks that flew between. And Peter and I used to spend hours arguing about certain aspects of the work, only 2 hours later to realize that we've been saying exactly the same thing in a completely different way. And he was someone who was always far more excited by the discovery and the journey rather than leaving a trail of where he'd been. And a lot of the discussion was how we could improve the remediation side of it. They moved from simply using exercises that were the opposite of the reflexes to looking at normal child development and saying, what is the clue in what happens in normal child development that naturally integrates the reflexes at the right time, and what could have gone wrong in children where this hasn't occurred? And that's what really took me back to looking at what does happen in normal child development, where do deviations occur? And how can we look at normal development and use it as a solution to those children who have, for some reason, missed out on one of those stages or bypassed them because they were ill or abuse or neglect or something? And that's really what took me into the sort of underlying neurology and normal child development side of it. So again, by accident, really.
That's awesome. It's fascinating stuff. And so can you sort of describe to everyone what exactly is a primitive reflex? How would you describe that? And I've probably been asked it many times, but yeah.
Primitive reflexes are a specific group of reflexes. There are many others which develop during life in the womb, starting from about 9 weeks after conception. They continue to develop throughout pregnancy, so they should be fully active at the time of birth in a baby born at full term, at 40 weeks gestation. And we know that in children who are born very prematurely, some of those early reflexes are not fully developed at the time of birth. So things like suck reflex, grasping reflexes, and so on. But in normal development, healthy baby born at full term, it should be born with a set of primitive reflexes, which are thought to help it survive the first few weeks and months of life. Nobody's really sure what their real function is. But they do also provide very rudimentary subconscious training for later, more complex skills. Then, as connections to higher centers in the brain develop, which they do very quickly in that first 6 months of life, gradually those primitive reflexes are no longer as necessary, and they are inhibited or put to sleep in the brainstem. They never entirely desert us. So if there is accident or injury to higher centers at any time, those reflexes may be released or disinhibited as a result of the fact that higher centers are not able to do their job as efficiently as they should.
And so what would be an instance that would, sorry to cut you off there, but what would be an instance that would disinhibit a reflex that was already retained?
So demyelination conditions such as multiple sclerosis, as the myelin sheath starts to become destroyed, then some of the primitive reflexes will re-emerge, of which the Babinski reflex is one of the first. And so you see the extension of the great toe, which is in itself the expression of the reflex, which is a result of demyelination. But by that reflex reappearing, it alters the tone in the back of the legs and may contribute to the gait and the characteristic shuffle that you see in MS. So the reflex is not the primary cause of that, but it becomes a mechanical problem that then may contribute to some of the symptoms that you are seeing.
Yes, wow.
Similarly, in Alzheimer's disease, that would be another example of a degenerative disease in which the primitive reflexes re-emerge in the reverse chronological order of their inhibition in the first 6 months of life.
Is the Babinski the last one to integrate, is it? Or?
No, it's, do you know, off the top of my head, I don't know. It is later than some of the others, certainly, yes. I'd need to look it up.
As I think there's the Moro, one of the first ones. One of the first.
Moro is one of the earliest. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is it? What about stroke as well? I've heard as stroke is one of the conditions that can potentially disinhibit.
Well, yes, I mean, we think any form of brain injury can potentially disinhibit. So at the other end of life, if a baby has cerebral palsy, because of the damage to specific areas of the brain around the time of birth, the primitive reflexes never become fully inhibited, and they are a diagnostic signpost of cerebral palsy. Again, they're not the primary cause, they are a secondary consequence of. But as such, and this is, perhaps it's no bad thing, we're getting ahead of ourselves, as such, we use them as clinical tools to identify whether there is an immaturity in the functioning of the central nervous system. And those clinical tools help us to see at what stage in development we need to return to put in the correct information to try and change the functioning of the individual.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's amazing. And we have primitive reflexes, and how many primitive reflexes are there in total? Do you remember?
Sorry, you sort of broke up for a moment there. How many are there in total?
Yeah, how many primitive reflexes? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, aren't I?
I hate this question. Do you know, I've never counted. Somebody else asked me recently. I looked it up and then promptly forgot it again. Again, it's one of those. There are a number. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact
or something like that.
number. Yeah, so something in that region wouldn't be far off.
And then so you have the primitive reflexes, which are all generally inhibited, in the first year of life. And then you have another set of reflexes called the postural reflexes. And how do they differ?
Yes, postural reflexes, sometimes referred to as postural reactions. These are later reactions that develop after birth, and they take up to 3.5 years of life to be fully developed. So it's a sort of long transition period. And there is an interaction between the primitive and the postural reflexes in that first year of life, whereby as the primitive reflexes are receding, so another postural reflex is coming in, not necessarily to replace it, but to transform that reaction into something more sophisticated and something that is less of a reflex and more adaptable in terms of response. So collectively, the postural reflexes give us a sort of subconscious control of posture, balance, and coordination in a gravity-based environment. So you don't have to think about how do I sit, how do I stand. A lot of that's done at a subconscious level. And so I describe them collectively as being a little bit like a really good personal assistant or secretary to the executive part of the brain. If the PA is doing her job efficiently, the executive can float around the world doing all the exciting things they're supposed to do. But if you have a PA who's constantly off sick, who's not doing their job properly, then the executive is constantly having to worry about and think about all the other things. And that creates a level of stress, a level of anxiety, and lowers performance.
That's a really good analogy. I'm going to use that one. Very good. So is that, when we're talking about the postural reflexes, is this like the equilibrium sort of writing reflexes and visual postural reactions and stuff like that?
Yes, they are the adaptive response to change in position and change in environment.
So like if someone were to push me here, my body would, my neck would do this to try and right it. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So we should develop a set of what are called head writing reflexes. So just as you've shown, I don't know if I can do it on here, if the body is tilted, the head doesn't continue to go with the body or below it. the head automatically writes itself to the midline, which allows us to access change in muscle tone on the other side, hopefully to maintain equilibrium. But if the head goes down in line with the body or below it, then the reference point that the balance mechanism is taking, instead of being here in relation to its supporting base, is actually at a 40 angle. And because centers involved in the control of eye movements use this as their postural reference point, we can predict if those head writing reflexes are underdeveloped, that when we come to test the eye movements needed for reading, for readjustment of focus between different distances and so on, those eye movements are going to be unstable or immature because they don't have the secure postural base to support them.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. There is a relationship between the writing and the neck and then the eyes, isn't there? And even sometimes neck issues can result from ocular issues or the other way around. It's pretty cool.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've used that with the writing reflexes. I've done primitive reflex work as well, but in terms of rehabilitation with people, I think utilizing those tilting and writing reflexes is really powerful way for tapping into the subconscious or primitive brain to sort of give it a bit of safety so it can feel a bit safer in the environment. Is that, you heard about?
Yes, I mean, I think it's what gives us our sense of what Jean Ayres described as gravitational security, our physical confidence and competence in space. And if you feel physically secure, you have a much better basis for emotional security as well.
It's amazing. So how do retained primitive reflexes affect our psychology and our cognition, so our ability to think?
Let me just remind myself, because I wrote down some notes for this because I knew I'd forget in order what this is. So I think we just touched on cognitively, if the reflexes affect the control of eye movements and those eye movements are unstable. So for example, if an eye is trying to follow along, the eyes are trying to follow along a line of print and they jump occasionally, the brain will believe that what the information the eyes have sent is correct, and it will read what the eyes have sent, but it will then miss out certain letters, certain words, so it can sometimes be associated with reading difficulties. It can also have quite a profound effect on visual perception. So we get children as part of our assessment to do some visual perceptual tests where they have to copy certain shapes. And some children will completely distort certain shapes when they draw them. And we'll ask them to look at what they were copying from and what they've actually done and say, are you satisfied that what you've done looks like what you're copying from? And they'll say yes. And therefore, they are not seeing the same as you and I see when they're looking at those shapes. So if you don't see the same as your teacher is seeing when you're in class, you are going to have problems. So something as simple as a poor control of eye movements can affect visual perception, which can then affect how the brain interprets information that is being sent via the visual system. And that then affects cognition because you are getting faulty information, incoming information being sent to the brain for it to work with. So there can be perceptual issues which are not just confined to vision, but then you can have specific motor issues. So for example, if something called the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex is retained or residually present, when the head turns to one side, the arm and hand on that side want to straighten and the opposite want to bend. If that's still there when you go to school and you're trying to write, when you try and write, it's fine as long as your head's in the middle, but as soon as you start turning the head, this is what the writing hand would really like to do.
Yes.
So the intelligent child can find compensations. They can hold the pen very tightly. They can have the paper at a certain angle so they can write with a straight arm, but they never become automatic in the physical mechanics of writing. So they have to use much more cognitive effort to control the writing hand, which then scavenges from the ability to think and write at the same time. So you have both a mechanical problem that can affect the quantity and quality of handwriting per se, but it can also then interfere with the ability to translate thoughts, ideas onto paper.
There's a lack of integration, and the brain has to use more fuel to, perform those functions. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Is there a connection with? Sorry, what were we going to say? You
No,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to see if I'd missed anything, but go on, because you'll probably remind me while you do it.
With the ATNR, the asymmetric tonic neck writing reflex, is there a connection with, because it's about crossing the midline, right? The ability to cross the midline. Is there a connection with, say, like swimming or freestyle swimming?
There may be, in as far as if the ATNR is present in infancy, it can affect the ability to learn how to commando crawl on your tummy, which is very similar to the movements that you use when you're swimming. You've got to be able to use all 4 quadrants of the body independently and cooperatively in order to carry out certain strokes in swimming. The one that is most often associated with difficulties with breaststroke is actually the symmetrical tonic neck reflex, where the top and bottom sections of the body don't want to work together.
Yeah.
And in breaststroke, you're actually having to coordinate and synchronize that.
Yes.
So different reflexes or combinations of reflexes may interfere with specific things rather than generalized all of swimming. It can be certain aspects of it.
That's awesome. Really cool stuff. And so the impacts on a child and then also an adult psychology, if they have retained reflexes, how would that affect someone's psychology?
So again, if there is a distortion or delay in how sensory information is being processed, you cannot be as adaptive in new and changing environments. So if you are slower at processing visual information, for example, the example I was given I'm teaching is that I reached the age of becoming not only extremely short-sighted, but long-sighted as well. And I was probably too vain to acknowledge it. And I couldn't understand why when I was going to London to work, I was getting incredibly stressed in the underground when I was trying to use the tube. Because everything seemed to be moving so fast. And I was spending a fortune on taking taxis because the natural thing to do is to avoid the thing that makes you stress and find another way of doing it. And I realized the problem was I couldn't see fast enough to get the ticket from the machine, put the ticket through the barrier as you were going. And this was what was causing the stress. And as soon as I got glasses and I learned to wear them on my head and to be able to do this with them, all the anxiety, or most of the anxiety, started to go. Wow. So something as simple as a correctable visual problem can create stress in environments where you have to process that information at speed. That's just one sort of very simple example.
Yeah, it's amazing.
In agoraphobia, you can have something like where there are banks of fluorescent lights. You've got lots of stacks of shelves, so supermarkets, for example, where they're constantly changing where things are presented. That combination of bright lights, changing visual stimuli, having to walk down, avoid crowds and so on, that can be enough in certain individuals to trigger a sort of visual overload that then alerts the panic alarm system. Yeah. And you only need that to happen once or twice in a specific situation to say, I don't like going there anymore. I can't go shopping by myself. If we take this at several years down the line, if this is not recognized for what it is, it could potentially develop into a form of agoraphobia. There are other causes of agoraphobia. There are obviously emotional triggers and so on. But this can be a very specific vestibular to visual dysfunction, which then starts to affect aspects of behavior and how we interpret the different environments. So that's one.
That's amazing.
Another is the if you know something, but you cannot express it adequately. So if we think that the motor system is our main medium for expressing what we know and who we are, we know that when primitive reflexes persist, particularly in children, it limits their vocabulary, their own vocabulary of movement, quite often their own body image as well, which then makes it more difficult for them to read the body language of others and respond appropriately to it. So you often see that children with a lot of primitive reflex issues not only have the sort of borderline diagnoses of things like developmental coordination disorder, and it's seen as part of that is that they seem to have problems with social relationships, particularly peer relationships. Adults will be more understanding, but children in a playground, they will pick out immediately the one who is awkward, the one who doesn't know when to back off in a game or in a conversation. And that can affect social relationships, as well as result in a high degree of frustration. If you're intelligent, highly intelligent, but you cannot show it, you can't express it either verbally or you can't express it in written form, and you're always underperforming and underachieving, that creates a sense of inadequacy. It can affect the sense of, the ego, strength of the ego, and all those things that then become interpreted as psychological problems, which they are. But those psychological problems may be secondary to an underlying physical difficulty that is blocking that individual from being the person that they should be.
Yeah, so it's a neurophysiological or neurobiological cause that has resulted in psychological or symptoms, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and with the untrained eye, you won't be able to tell, would you? But I mean, I've seen this a lot. You need to be able to know what to look for in these sort of cases, otherwise you might miss it.
Yes, you need to be able to read body language well, I think.
And so does this tie into the polyvagal theory with the social engagement system and stuff like that? Have you heard of that? Dr. Stephen Porges?
Yes, polyvagal system. I mean, they're wonderful papers, Stephen Porges' papers, and they were published a little while after we'd done some work, which we never really wrote about in very much detail, looking at the relationship between the three levels of startle response. So I think that we are talking about the same thing with the polyvagal theory, but using different language to describe it. So if we look at the different stages of startle response in before birth, immediately after birth, and as we grow up, the most primitive startle response is the freeze response, which develops in the embryo at about 5 to 7.5 weeks after conception. So if there's something that it senses as being threatening occurs, like an amoeba, it will withdraw, shrink away into itself, and it won't respond until it senses that that threat has gone. About 9 weeks after conception, the Moro Reflex starts to develop. It takes up to 32 weeks to develop. And that's completely the opposite. Well, no, it isn't actually. It begins as a withdrawal response, but the second part of it is actually a clasping on and an immediate arousal response. So whereas one is a shutting down and running away, the next stage is an arousal and get me out of here response in very simplistic language. Somewhere around 4 months of age, that starts to be transformed into an adult startle response. So something unexpected happens, the baby blinks, raises its shoulders, and starts to use its senses to search the environment and make a thinking decision. Do I need to react to this, or can I ignore it and carry on with what I was doing? Now, if you still have either of those earlier responses overactive in the system, you don't have the luxury of the few seconds of searching the environment and making a thinking decision. You react first, and 2 seconds later, the thinking brain says, why did I just do that? It wasn't anything to be scared of. But because you have activated one of those earlier reflex reactions to startle, the hormones associated with it have already been released into the system, so that you feel physically as if you've had a real fright, even though cognitively you know something different. So you get a conflict between what I know and what I feel. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be, particularly if it's something that happens regularly and you have no control over when it's going to happen and when it isn't. So when Porges is talking about the polyvagal theory, I think the very primitive level he talks about is what we would refer to as the fear paralysis response. The next level is like the Moro reflex, and the more adult level is the adult startle response, where you have a moment in which you can choose. Do I need to fight or flee, or can I actually stand here and deal with it?
So can I be alert without arousal? So I can basically go, oh, and then sort of go, that was okay. I know what's going on. That's awesome, because that brings those two systems together. Because I know I've studied quite a lot of polyvagal as well, and I always, and when I was taught initially about it, and there was a relationship between the freeze response, that dorsal vagal response, and that stage one kind of Moro breath hold paralysis response, right?
Yes, which the first part of it is that, but then you should have the override. So the first part is, and the second part is to cling on to mummy, scream and say, come and help.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think the best description I heard were someone talking about something completely different, saying if you have part of the fear paralysis and Moro together, which you can have, or it can be activated as a result of an extreme real threat, it's as if the brake and the accelerator are being applied at the same time.
Wow.
That you have this huge need to respond, but you can't.
That's crazy. Yeah, that must be frightening.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, I think, sometimes what happens in extreme life-threatening situations.
Trauma, severe trauma.
Yes.
Life
and I suppose that's the sort of other area of this. Many years ago, somebody came to train with us who at the time was working at the Torture and Trauma Centre in London, where some of the hostages who'd been held captive in Beirut had been taken to for some of their sort of rehabilitation afterwards. And when we asked him why he'd come on our course, because it seemed to be such a sort of leap from what he was trying to work with immediately, he said, sometimes in situations where neither fight nor flight can help you, so when you're kidnapped, neither of those is going to help. You're probably going to get into more trouble if you try to escape and get kidnapped. People actually recede into themselves and find a place of safety where nothing that's being done to them can actually touch them.
Yeah.
Almost like a form of meditation. And he said over a long period of time, some of them have been so successful at doing this that when they're released, they cannot get out of it.
Yeah, wow.
And trying to work cognitively is too high up. This is something that they have learned to intellectualize and to control. And you have to go deeper and work with the body. And he felt that what we were doing might have had a little piece of the answer to that. He then left us and we never heard what he did with it afterwards. So I don't know whether it was successful or not.
Maybe. So that was what you're describing there was sort of what sounds a little bit to me like disassociation.
Yes, a disassociation for your own self-defense, which, it comes into many forms of sort of psychological trauma, neglect and so on. So I think we see it sometimes in post-adoptive children where there have been a lot of separations and it's called an attachment disorder. It is, but it's also something else as well.
So I think there's like what you said about meditation. I've done some like Vipassana style meditation where you're actually training your mind to be equanimous, which means that you're non-reactive to stimuli. So you're non-reactive to positive or negative stimuli, which is kind of disassociating from the symptoms, but it's done in a controlled way. Whereas I think sometimes with disassociation in response to trauma, they can actually become numb to all feelings. And whereas in a meditative way, you're actually still feeling it fully, but you're choosing not to react to it in the moment.
Yes.
That makes sense. So
yes, it does. Yes, it's a very good explanation, I think. And then you might have heard of some of the work of Michael Tyker. I think he wrote a wonderful paper called Scars That Do Not Heal, looking at prenatal trauma. And how they think that severe trauma before birth, that sometimes as neurons are migrating to their target address in the brain, they change direction to avoid the re-experience of pain again, so that literally the developing architecture of the brain changes as a result of severe neglect or abuse.
That makes sense. Yeah, because we see that in pain, and you see the brain changes itself in response to a painful area. So it wouldn't, in terms of trauma, think that if someone is psychologically trying to get away from something, they're going to have some sort of motor reaction towards that as well. So then that maybe will change. You get a motor reaction, and that changes how the brain
changes the neural pathway works as well. Yes, I think
cool.
So. Yes,
Awesome, really cool stuff. Okay, so anything more on like the psychology and cognition you think is important to share?
Not that only in as far as I think just following on from that idea of not being able to express adequately what you want to say, that then the sort of psychological outcomes we might see from that are not just underachievement and inadequacy, but pent-up anger. This sort of feeling of anger, which either it tends to come out in explosions occasionally. Or if it's turned inwards, anger tends to become depression. So over a long period of time, you might see those sort of patterns developing. It depends a lot on the resilience of the individual.
Why do you think anger becomes depression? Because I have heard that before. Suppressed anger.
When something is suppressed and suppressed and suppressed, and you cannot release it, it becomes a form of hopelessness and helplessness, which is the fertile ground, really, for giving up. This sense of being, I cannot do anything, and therefore I become depressed.
There's no choice that you can make. That's
and
awesome.
That ties in, I think, which is one of your other questions later on. There was a work of a Frenchman called Laborie who talked about hopelessness and helplessness being one of the biggest triggers to changes in how the immune system functions. It changes us chemically and hormonally as well.
That makes complete sense. That's awesome. So in response to, like, we've talked about a lot about the psychology and cognition and how that sort of affects everything else. How do these, like if you have retained primitive or postural reflexes, how do they affect our movement and postural control? I know we've already touched on this, but how would this, say, affect like, a rehabilitation? So, you've mentioned other conditions like cerebral palsy or stroke or other types of postural or movement conditions, or even traumatic brain injury.
Okay, so let's start with the sort of simple bits, which is if certain reflexes fail to be integrated, and it's not one on its own, it's very rarely one by itself, it's a cluster. So you have traces of primitive reflexes still active, and some of the posturals have developed, but not quite enough. It alters the vocabulary of movement that we have available. So the way that we move, how we are able to learn new skills, whether we do get better at things and when we practice them or not, can be limited by that individual reflex profile. So it can affect sports, it could affect certain things like playing the piano or something. It depends what the reflex profile is of the individual. But also it can create what we call a mismatch between the functioning of the vestibular system here and the proprioceptive feedback received from the body as a result of carrying out a movement. So if you have reflexes that are elicited as a result of movement of the head, so either flexion, extension, lateral rotation, or tilting, they alter the muscle tone response to that head movement. So you have the vestibular system and the executive part of the brain saying, this is what I want your body to do. And your body does something different from what it would ideally like it to do. So you get what we call this mismatch between vestibular and proprioceptive. And that then affects control of movement. It affects the ability to plan movement sometimes. I mean, proprioception, it's funny how you come to different things later in life. All of Peter's interest was vestibular. Mine was visual because I've always had awful eyesight. So we try and solve our own problems all through life. And then much later on, my partner has a form of cancer where the chemotherapy that he has had has created peripheral neuropathy. So that now, sometimes he knows perfectly well how to go up and down stairs. But because the feedback from the feet and the lower part of the legs is not good, the motor planning side of the brain sometimes can't work out how to do it. And so what looks like a motor planning problem and could be misinterpreted as a motor planning problem isn't actually a primary motor planning problem. It's secondary to the fact that the proprioceptive feedback from the body is inadequate for the brain then to tell it what to do next. So as a result of this mismatch, it can affect all sorts of things. So not just execution of movements, but motor planning and all the other aspects of motor performance as well as posture. If you have a reflex which when you put your head forward causes the upper portion of your body to want to flex, it affects your ability to stand up straight, to sit up straight, to sit comfortably, and so on. So posture and motor performance can all be affected.
I mean, those vestibular reflexes on the head are pretty interesting because, like, if our head moves forward, out the muscles on the front of our body will facilitate, right? And then the head moves backwards, the muscles on the back of the body will facilitate. And if we turn our head, all the ones that turn our body will facilitate. So it's like whatever happens up here then sends a command down there, which then has to be bounced back up,
Yes.
and something
So,
like 19
so
times.
ideally, we should have what I call freedom of head movement from the body. We should be able to do these things without the body automatically doing something. And so I always say the single most important thing a baby ever learns to do in the first few weeks of life is to hold its head up in the correct relationship with its body. Because until it can do that, if it moves its head up, everything else is moving with it. That then creates muscle tension here that causes problems further down, can be referred up as headaches, visual headaches, all sorts of things can be secondary consequences of the fact that you simply don't have freedom of head from body reaction. And that's where these reflexes play a pivotal part.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yes, you do say that a lot. Often I'm assessing people in clinic and looking at their range of motion, and their neck and their thorax are just stuck together, or they have to then, if you tell them to keep their head still and then track and eyes, they have to move their neck. So there's all these things that are clumped together that should be disassociated from each other, right?
Yes, yes.
To be able to create fluid movement.
Yes, and to be able to direct what you want and adapt. Whereas the more rigid you are, the less range of possible movements you have available.
And as I say, like you say, motor, people think it's a motor, but a few of the people I've learnt off in the neurology world have always say, motor control is sensory driven. So it's really determined. It's like 75% of it is the richness of the input coming into the brain, and then can the brain integrate that input through all the systems, and then that creates an output. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can have, if we take the Moro Reflex, for example, which is multisensory in terms of what it responds to, whereas some reflexes are specific to a particular sensory stimuli. Yeah. The Moro Reflex is multisensory. So if you have someone who has an extremely impaired vision, if something comes towards them at speed, by the time they can see it sufficiently to be able to respond, it's too late. And so you may see in that individual a Moro response, not because they primarily have a Moro reflex, but because it can be elicited specifically by rapidly moving visual stimuli, because the visual system is not able to do its job as the brain would like it to. Yeah. So yes, you're absolutely right. You cannot separate motor and sensory. They are totally interdependent.
Yeah, that's interesting. Awesome. And so do you feel like sort of manual therapists and people who work with the body, do you feel like they need to have some sort of understanding of how these primitive and postural reflexes
I think it can be helpful. I mean, when we work together with other manual therapists, it works really well, because they may have, as you mentioned, I can't remember, it was before we started this formally and we were just chatting on it, we were talking about how somebody can go back with the same problem over and over again. The structural part of it can be temporarily fixed. But if, because of a reflex problem, they are habitually using their body in a certain way, that functional abnormality will prevent the structural correction from holding over time. So when people who are working with, I mean, they're working with function as well, but they are looking at structure primarily. If they can understand where something may interfere with the long-term efficacy of what they're doing, and functional work can be done alongside it, then that can work really well, and vice versa. Sometimes we find that when we're trying to assess a child, there's such a restricted range of movement on one side only, that however many exercises we give them to work on the reflex, they're not going to be effective if there's a structural blockage here that needs to be released if possible.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay. If we have a retained reflex or cluster of reflexes, does that have any effect on the immune system?
We think so, and this is more based on empirical evidence. The children that we see before we start working with them have a much higher percentage of history of lots of infections, allergies, those sort of things in the early years of life than you would perhaps normally expect. So whether that has contributed to the problems that we see in terms of reflexes, or whether because they had reflexes, they are children who are more prone to be easily stressed. And the stress response results in overproduction of some of those hormones that should normally be there, things like cortisol, to protect against inflammatory responses and so on.
Yeah.
We don't know, but there seems to be a greater degree of incidence of individuals with a history of less well immune functioning than perhaps you'd expect in the general population. What the cause is, we can't really say.
So that's just clinical observations.
Yes, yes.
I can say that in my clinical observations, I've seen the same thing.
Interesting, yes. Yeah. So before we assess children, we take quite a thorough developmental history. And it's really looking at those developmental histories over thousands of children over many, many years where you see this.
Yeah.
Say about 30 to 40% incidence off the top of my head. I may not be accurate about that, but of history of asthma, eczema, gut-related allergies, of which the gut part may be very, very important. And that's another whole issue.
I've seen some papers on that, actually, the links between the Moro and the gut and things like that.
Right. I'd like to see some of those if you can send them to me afterwards.
Now I've got to find them again. Awesome. Yeah, cool. That's awesome. So yeah, I have seen that in clinic, and it just seems to be that there are some, like, and some of them are adults that have this stuff hasn't been picked up, so they have, like, I've seen a few links between, this is just anecdotal and my experience, and I have tried to find a bit of research that sort of backs it up or disproves it, but I've seen that, people with like fibromyalgia, like really chronic pain conditions, I watch them move, and I'm just like, there's just no coordination anywhere, and I'm thinking, okay, maybe there's some reflexes there. You ask about the birth history, you do the questionnaires, you do the assessments, and you see all this sort of stuff. And then throughout their life, they've had lots of different autoimmune or skin conditions or gut conditions, and now they've got a chronic pain condition, and their ability to respond to stress is just, it's the much lower threshold. So their threshold is just low. So they're just like, they're fighting. It's almost like they seem to be fighting an uphill battle just to get through life, just to do the normal things that we take for granted. And so they end up becoming, they end up being stuck in therapy offices, seeing practitioners and specialists and stuff like that. So it's not everyone, but I have definitely seen a bit of a link there through some of the people I've seen.
Yes, and I think you've described beautifully what we have seen over many, many years, that particularly in adults with so-called psychological and emotional problems, that they have been through every form of therapy that you can think of. They have a fantastic intellectual understanding of why they have the problems that they do. But it doesn't help them to change. And Peter always said, if there is a conflict between feelings and logic, if the feelings are too strong, the feelings will always win. And what we have to ask if we're going to be effective is why? What is generating those feelings? Is it as a result of illness? And as we all know, when we're ill, we become more easily upset. We can't cope with things as much. We become fatigued more easily. Or is the illness a secondary consequence of the fact that, as you said, these people have struggled all their lives simply to function? And because of that, they become more prone not only to stress, but to physical illness as well. Yeah,
and it's like they're sensitive and to begin with, so they're easily triggered, and then because they become, the more and more they get triggered, the more and more sensitive they become. So it's just like
the hypervigilance, this sort of constant state of hypervigilance, which then sensitizes you to be more sensitive.
And would you relate that back to sort of interoception versus exteroception, being that I know that in the reflex responses, often there's exteroreceptive inputs or proprioceptive inputs that they're responding to, meaning that it could be a sound or something in the peripheral vision, or it could be a smell or something like that, or a change in elevation. There's external inputs, but then over time, sometimes it's actually the feelings that like you said just then, feelings which are interoceptive. They're within the body, they're within the viscera, and they project into the insular cortex and the brain. And sometimes that area becomes hypersensitive. So they might think it's actually an external trigger, but it's actually an internal trigger which creates a reflex or some sort of stress
Yes,
response.
I mean, I think you can have an emotional hypervigilance that makes that reflex more potentially reactive. You can also have where the interoceptor systems are not working as well as they should. So if you have vestibular or proprioceptive dysfunction, then the exteroceptor systems of vision and hearing and touch have to work twice as hard to compensate, and they become overloaded more quickly. And there was a third thing, but it's just gone straight out of my head. It's never mind, it'll come back. No, never mind, carry on.
All good, it'll come back.
Age.
It'll come back. So yeah, so it's pretty cool. So this work's been around for about 20, 30, 40 years, and it's permeated into
longer
education.
Now.
Longer?
I mean, Peter and David started in 1969, so we're talking pretty much 50 years now, aren't we? And yet it's still not part of mainstream anything. There are people like you, there are many other professionals who've come in from educational, psychological, sports science, medical backgrounds, who've come for their own interest and trained, but it hasn't become a watershed that's been integrated into other professions. And that's really, for me, the big gap, the gap that I would like to see bridged in the next few years.
Why do you think that is?
I think partly because it spans so many different professional disciplines, so that the testing procedures that we use are taken directly from mainstream medicine. That if a pediatrician, physio, occupational therapist use those tests, they should come up with exactly the same results. And that's the part that we have been absolutely adamant that we need to stick to, that we don't go too much into the esoteric side of it. We say what we do is replicable, but anyone else, given the same tests and the same training, can find it. So the assessment side of it has come largely from mainstream medicine. The intervention side of it is closer to sensory integration therapy, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, but then it crosses into things like manual therapy and outside of sort of mainstream medicine. The application of it is largely to problems of an educational nature, but teachers are not generally trained in teachers' training in the physical aspects of learning, only in how to provide knowledge. And it's all, the application is also to psychology. And yet I don't have a medical background. My professional training or qualification is in psychology. So some of these things have crossed beyond really the domain in which traditionally I would be working with. And in this country, the British Psychological Society won't recognise the work that we do because it's not primarily psychological in nature. It's using psychology as a starting point symptomatically and saying, now let's go back and unravel what physical factors may be creating psychological symptoms in these individuals. So I think it's a difficult one because it doesn't fit neatly or hasn't fitted neatly into any particular psychological discipline. It doesn't mean to say it can't. I mean, I would like to see that in teacher training, we reinstated some things that had been there 30 years ago. So one of my older sisters was a teacher, and in the days she trained, they had quite a lot of time spent on Piaget, the sensory motor stages of development. Now that's largely gone from teacher training education. If I ask a group of trainee teachers, how much time did you spend on the physical basis for learning? I'm lucky if one hand in a group of 30 goes up. And that's maybe been one lecture. Similarly, in medicine, the primitive reflexes are recognized as being important around the time of birth, assessment of the neonatal. Then my last midwife's lecture for one of our courses, she said the postnatal check is no longer including all the reflexes as part of that procedure because it's not thought to be important anymore. So there they have the knowledge, but forgetting why it may be significant. And because if a child passes their immediate postnatal pediatric examination, the reflexes are not looked at again after 6 weeks. A lot of the teaching is, well, the reflexes cannot be there later on because that's what we've been taught. There would have to be some form of pathology for the reflexes to persist. So there is a difficulty in the language that's being used to recognize the different level of reflex involvement in an older child, they're not fully retained in a young baby, all of them. Otherwise, that child would behave like somebody with cerebral palsy. But traces of them can persist, and that's the part that gets missed. So what I've worked really hard to do over the last few years is really to write up in some of the books published by Wiley Blackwell what I think is professionally defendable, can't think what the right grammatical term is, whether you're looking at medicine, whether you're looking at education, or whether you're looking at psychology. Let's look at a common language for these and describe these using that common language in the hope that that will become translated more into those professions in the future. So the next generation who are learning how to be whatever they're going to be have this within their psyche when they go into practice.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's one of those things. It is quite a big area, but it's like one of those things that when you learn it and you actually understand it, it's like you can't unknow it. So it's like you can't.
Yes, it's like learning another language, isn't it? Yeah. You can no longer not understand it when you hear it once you've learned it.
And it sort of paints you. It taints you, like how it shapes how you look at things. So it's one of those things that I've just kept trying to revisit and look at. And it's not nothing's the be all and end all with anything. It's just. I think it's something that we all do, and then some people don't do it properly. So why not? You know, if we know how important the beginning of life is, why don't we just have a look and just, if it's not there, then we go, okay, cool, it's not there. Then we don't have to worry about that. Then but we've had a look at it. So that's sort of my approach to it.
And that sounds very similar to mine, which is, I hear what I call an awful lot of secondhand rubbish written about reflexes, where people say, oh, this reflex will cause such and such and such and such and such. And we say, no, we can't say that, because the effect of those things will be as individual as the person, the profile of reflexes they've got, and the journey that they have traveled to reach that point. So the reflexes are really only tools to help us understand the problem that we've got in front of us. And if we believe there are reflexes there, and I hate the idea that you believe this is not a religion, then you should always check it out and test for it. And if it's not there, it's not the solution.
Yeah, exactly.
But it helps inform you as to how and where you could start.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I don't know if we've covered this yet, but it's just like, so what would be, especially for parents and stuff like that, so what would be some of the signs, or what would be some of the causes that would that could interrupt normal inhibition of these reflexes or reintegration into the nervous system?
Well, in the majority of children we see, it's a cluster of factors. It's 7 or more in early development. It's very rarely one single thing. The only time you might see a possible single causal factor was if there had been severe oxygen deprivation at birth, and that therefore there had been perhaps a degree of brain damage that had never been formally identified. But more often than not, it's a collection of things. So we know that there can be what appear to be family tendencies, that certain children we see there is a family history of this sort of thing. And it's not necessarily just presenting with a reading difficulty or dyslexia. There's a whole syndrome of things. So dyslexia, developmental coordination disorder, minor end of the autistic spectrum, the development of secondary neuroses, allergies. It's a sort of syndrome of factors that seem to be associated with a particular family. But it doesn't mean to say that because one member of that family has it, that they will pass it on to the next generation, because the law of genetics go back at least 4 generations. So I often describe that genetic thread as being a possibility that appears somewhere and might weave itself into one member of the next generation, skip the next one, and then appear in 2 or 3 of the next, and so on. So you can have that as an underlying background, the potential, a greater potential in a family to perhaps develop these things. But then you have all the factors such as circumstances of conception. Was this a natural conception, or was it an assisted conception? What the pregnancy itself was like, what the birth process was like, what the movement experience of that child was like in the first year of life, whether they had any serious illnesses. And this is how you get this collection of about 7 or more factors before we say, when we see an individual for an initial, yes, we think it's worth doing an assessment. One swallow by itself does not make a summer. You need to see them everywhere, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's awesome. Fantastic stuff. So where do you see this work going, and how do you see it developing?
I would like to see, as I sort of mentioned, this going into the training of the next generations of teachers so that they go into their teaching career with an understanding of why a child who is not responding to more of the same in terms of teaching input might not be performing and achieving what they are capable of, instead of just saying, right, let's put more and more special needs resources. Yes, those are necessary to make up the educational deficit, but actually let's look at the underlying structure and see if there's something we can do. So the school program already does that. It gives teachers in a one-day course a 15-minute screening test that they can go and use with all children in the class if they want to, and if they have the time to. They can identify which children may be at risk of underachieving as a result of physical difficulties. And then they can put a whole class-based program into place, which is done over 1 academic year under teacher supervision, 10 minutes of developmental movements each day, working through a sequence. So they don't have to have a full training in therapy, where they select specific exercises based on an assessment. It's simply a developmental movement program that they gradually move the whole class through over the course of a year. And I never thought when we started it that it would be as successful as the clinical program. And I've been very surprised in the studies that we've done to see how it doesn't solve everything, but how good it is in moving children forward, children who would otherwise perhaps just have got lost in the system. So I would like to see widespread screening of children at certain key stages in development, preschool, 7 years of age, perhaps again at 9, 10 years of age, and different levels of intervention being provided as a matter of routine, so that children don't get lost in the system as they currently do, where it's often 3 or 4 years of underachievement before they're picked up. They'll have been through GP, pediatrician, referral to occupational therapy, and it's probably taken 3 to 4 years before they then get through to educational psychology. At the end of that, they have lots of reports telling them exactly what they can't do, but no one has identified the underlying mechanisms. So lots of input is being put in terms of strategies and support, but nothing is being done at sort of baseline level. So that, in my view, could be avoided in many, many cases. And that then needs a greater cooperation between the professions of education and medicine, so that education can say, look, we think we've got more than a problem than can simply be resolved with a school program. Can you look at this further? And could they provide more clinical input in terms of providing a supporting service and better communication between the two? Because what often happens again is they get lost between those two systems. They get very good labels, but the intervention isn't perhaps quite what it could be.
Not really well thought out as much as it could be. One of my mentors, I remember, said, the success of any therapy depends on the basis of the problem.
Yes.
So, if you're treating something with the wrong drug, then anything's a drug. Movement's a drug. Movement therapy is a drug. If you're treating it with the wrong approach, then it's not going to work. It might be a great therapeutic approach, but if it's not entering at the right level, it's not going to work. So yeah.
And sometimes, if the wrong drug is given, it can actually create more of the very symptoms that you're trying to treat. This tends to happen in psychiatry sometimes. And sometimes the danger can be, oh, it's not working, let's give you more of it. And that's a possible way.
Let's just up the dose.
Yeah. And I love the saying that if more of the same hasn't worked, it's not the solution.
Yeah, it's good. Yep. Yeah, and getting the right dose at the right time of whatever it is. Yeah, whatever the brain needs. That's awesome. That's really cool stuff. Hopefully, it does get integrated into the school system, and more therapists also start to look at it and understand it and know who to refer to, and you can write more books and spread the word. I'll be there to help you do that.
Wonderful, thank you.
It's good stuff. I've got to get your book again. Actually, I just read it. I borrowed it off someone and read it, but I don't think I read every single bit of it. And I've got to get it again. I've got to order it. So I was hoping it was on Kindle, but it's not on Kindle yet, is it?
Which one? Which one are you talking
Reflexes
about?
in Learning and Behaviour.
Yes, I think probably you're beyond that now. If I were you, I'd go for one of the other ones, which I've got more updated information in them.
Which one's that?
Well, it depends if you want the heavy one. The heavy one is attention, balance, and coordination, the ABC of learning success. So that's the academic one.
Yeah.
The one that I would like people to read, and is the least well-selling, is Raising Happy, Healthy Children, where when I had my children, there were a lot of books on how to bring up your children, how to deal with problems. But nobody had written a book on what is the biological basis for healthy child development from the child's point of view. In other words, not what as parents we provide, but what do children actually need from the environment. And so that I started from all sort of preconception, what is the background that the child's being, and went up to the teenage years and looked at what are the biological factors that influence the development of the child. Reflexes are part of that, but where do they fit into this bigger context? That's my one I would like people to read. It's the one I think is important.
When we put this up, I'll put the links to those pages. Are they on Amazon or
if you go onto the books page of our website, yes, they should all be listed there.
And what's your website? So how do people follow you?
www.inpp.org.uk.
Cool. And do you do any social media or?
Yes, we have a Facebook page, Twitter page, and we also offer training courses at different levels as well.
Yeah, and they're face-to-face or online or both?
Well, COVID-19 is changing that. They always were face-to-face. I just delivered one module via Zoom 3 weeks ago for the first time. It's not ideally how we'd like to do it because some of it has to be practically based. Yeah. But I think in the future we will be able to offer parts of it online. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Good stuff. Well, it's been a fantastic chat today. So thank you very much for offering your time on a lovely, it looks like a sunny day there in the
it's a beautiful spring day. Yes.
That's awesome.
And thank you for making it so easy to chat.
No worries. Yeah, it's been great. I mean, I've learned heaps, and it's good to see the connections between different systems and how it's all put together. And to speak to you, because you have been doing this work for such a long time. So thank you for agreeing to this. And thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.